you doing, guys? Today I am continuing the reassembly of my 1955 Wisconsin AEN motor. Not only do I need to get the rod and the piston, the oil pump, all that stuff back in the block, but the other thing I need to get done, which I've been neglecting, is the tins. In order to get the flywheel on, I have to mount the blower cover to the block. So I need to get this painted and straightened out. In theory, I wasn't going to go completely bananas on this, but I'm going to have to do something with it. It's just, the tins are super rusty and really disgusting. So unfortunately, I did do the full strip, sandblast, and now doing some body work and prime work to get this thing smooth. Not arrow straight, but smooth. All right. This is what today's going to be all about. With the tins drying, let's go ahead and get back on the motor. Specifically, come on, I want to get this piston and rod into the motor. Also going to go downstairs and collect the oil pump. We're going to put the oil pump in and hopefully get the oil pan on, because that'll be huge. Piston, rod, rings are all done. The bearing shells are in. This is going to be a little cumbersome on the sheer fact that when I'm trying to drop that piston down in there with the ring compressor, I'm not really going to have a whole lot of ability to kind of protect the crank. So I'm going to rotate the crank around so the crank journal is going to be at the bottom. And I'm going to try to get this piston into the bore just far enough that all the rings will be in, and then I can flip the engine over and then kind of, or on its side, and I can kind of push it to the crank, because I don't want the bolts to bang the crank. I don't want the rod to jam up on one of the counterweights either. So I'm thinking we're going to have to set this down. It's a little high right now, so I think I'm going to have to set it down on a different workbench, a little lower, just to make it a little bit easier. But we do have our ring compressor. It's right there. It's my buddy's ring compressor. It's big enough to take this piston. My little Briggs & Stratton one won't work on this. So we're going to oil everything up, get everything all situated, and I'll show you how I get this thing into the block. Have the motor here up on the sawhorses. I went ahead and dribbled oil all over everything, kind of pre-lube everything. I put assembly lube on the cam lobes, so that should be all set. I went ahead, took a paper towel, a little brake cleaner, made sure my crank pin is nice and clean. I also wiped out the bore when I had the engine flipped over. One thing I need to be cognizant of is this is where the oil pump bolts to the block. It's on the same side as the magneto. So when I go ahead and drop that piston in, the cap, the oil hole in the cap has to face the oil pump, and that is according to the manual, which I will double check. But as of right now, I got the crank sort of in this position, so the pin is at the bottom, a little bit off center. So that way when I drop that piston down into the bore, in theory, we should not smash the weights, and we should not hit a bolt on the journal. So let me get this flipped over. It's going to make a mess everywhere, but that's fine because the oil is going to leak out. But the other thing too is I made sure that this thing, which is the oil pump rod, was lubricated. It moves super smooth and it's perfect. So we're good there. All right, let's get this thing flipped over. I'll get some oil in the bore, and we'll get ready to oil up the rings, stagger the rings, and drop it in. Essentially, I am ready to put the piston into the engine. Now I reoriented the engine so the magneto is on the right side, because that is where the oil pump is. The oil pump is right there. I need to have this cap, that hole right there, the oil hole, facing the oil pump. And we confirmed that with the manual, which says be sure that the oil hole in the connecting rod cap is facing toward the oil pump spray, as illustrated in figure 32. There's figure 32. There it is. So that is the orientation we have to have. One of the things is the rod, as I showed in one of my prior videos, is marked. So the numbers and the bearing slots have to match each other. So what I did was, like I said, I reoriented the motor. I know that this side needs to go towards the oil pump, okay? So I could just pick this up in theory and drop it in, and I know I'm all aligned. The other thing I did too is I made a couple marks with a Sharpie where the bolts are. So that way I know exactly how this piston is, you know, it's not going to be lined up this way or that way. So in theory, we shouldn't, oops, sorry. I think we get down in there. There it is. In theory, we're not going to hit the weights, and in theory, the journal is low enough where the bolts won't hit it. Now, I didn't have any rubber tube that fit these bolts, so what I did was I just wrapped the paper towel around the journal and put that in. But it should be far enough down that this rod's not even going to reach it, because my thought here is to get it lined up, everything oiled up like crazy, right? And I don't want to beat it down into the hole, but I want to kind of just give it a good, you know, good forceful push to get all the rings into the bore. When it comes to the rings, all of this will be covered in oil. The rings, the end gaps are going to be staggered 90 degrees to each other. So like the oil control ring will be here, you know, maybe the top compression ring over here, the second compression ring will be here, and then on the opposing side, the scraper ring on the other. So everything will be 90 degrees from each other, and I don't want to have a 90 degree here and a 90 degree here. I want to have a 90 degree here, the lowest, the oil ring, 90 degrees, and then the top ring opposing side of that. So that way everything is all staggered real nice, and everything's oiled up real nice. Crimp it all down with that, and get that thing into the bore. All right, well, let's see what happens. Rod and piston is installed. I torqued the bolts to 19 foot-pounds, and the reason for that, and why the weird number, says install new nuts on connecting rod bolts and torque 18 to 20 foot-pounds. So I split the difference. I just put it right to 19. We have the numbers and the oil hole facing the oil pump. That looks absolutely stunning. There isn't one mark in the bore. There's not a scrape mark. There's nothing. A little bit of the streaking you're seeing is just oil. That looks amazing. All right, I'm going to go ahead, swing the piston back up to the top of the bore, wipe everything off, and we'll examine the oil pump next. Next up is the oil pump. I got a brand new Wisconsin oil pump here. So one of the things that the manual says is to actually test it. And there is a little procedure here, right here, in testing the new oil pump, or even the old oil pump for that matter. So this is the plunger, which is actuated by the camshaft rod, okay? And it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and then it pumps oil and squirts it out that little hole. So in order to test it, they say to use the oil pan, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour some oil into this little plastic Chinese food cover, and I'm just going to pump it, make sure oil is pumping, and then we're going to flip that block over and mount the oil pump into place. With confirmation that the oil pump will pump oil, I went ahead and reinstalled it. It's held in by 2 1/4 bolts with lock washers. I went ahead and tightened those down to 10 foot-pounds. There isn't a spec in the manual, but 10 foot-pounds on a 1/4 going into cast iron is probably more than sufficient. Plus, there is lock washers in place. I did use the old pickup screen from the original engine or the original oil pump, because the screen that came with it doesn't fit. It just kind of flops around. This one here is nice. It fits, you know, it doesn't come off. So I went ahead and used the old one. I went ahead, also pulled out the oil pan, washed it down, make sure it was good and clean, because it's been sitting on the shelf for darn near a couple years. Went and got an oil pan gasket for the unit itself. There is a little cutout for the oil pump, so the gasket can only go in one direction, like that, with the oil pump. Now the oil pan has provisions for the oil pump in 2 of the corners. For the senior, the drain hole has to be in line with the drain fill, because it's all on one side. So when I go ahead and install this, I got to be mindful of that. So just put the gasket on the way it's supposed to be, and then make sure I orient the oil pan in the right direction. The other thing I had to do, or what I did, was I went to my little stock of new bolts. These are a 1/4, excuse me, 3/8 cap bolts, or I think they're called cap bolts, whatever. They are grade 8, but what I'm going to do, and they have a whole bunch of, there's lock washers on that too, but the original bolts, the threads were a little dinged up and messy, so I wasn't going to get involved with that. So I'm going to go ahead, clean everything up, make sure there's no oil, there's no anything. Going to go ahead, put the oil pan in place, put all the bolts in place with their lock washers, and torque it to 7 to 9 foot-pounds, just as the manual says. And hopefully we'll be in good shape. We can flip this thing back over onto the oil pan, and that'll be basically the last time we have to flip it over. All right, correction. If you look here, the bolt holes line up with the gasket, but when we come over to the other side, it doesn't line up at all. And there's no way to stretch it, right? So I guess what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go ahead and make a new gasket using the oil pan as a template. I might have enough gasket material. I don't know, but that's what we're leaning towards. Ran over to Advanced Auto, got myself a piece of gasket material. First thing I did was lay the oil pan on the material, traced out the outside, went ahead and traced where each one of the mounting bolts go. I took my little hole punch, punched the holes. As you can see, they lined up quite well. Took my utility knife, cut out, I just kind of pushed the knife through and then worked it around to get this is the engine mounting bolts. To mount the engine to the frame, it goes through these bolts. Next, I just took my little body hammer, tap, 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 and that gives me where the edge is. Then I could take my X-Acto, or my utility knife with a new blade, and just kind of work it around. Went ahead, cut out where the oil pump area is supposed to be, so that's all done. My edges are nice. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and pull all the bolts out. I'm just going to take a piece of sandpaper and lightly sand the inside edge, just to make sure there's nothing loose. Obviously, all this stuff needs to get thrown away, cleaned out. So, going to do that. Going to get it in place, get the pan in place, and start putting the bolts in. to wrap up this video, we'll go ahead and set the valve lash with the engine in the top dead center. So piston all the way up, valves closed. Theoretically, this is when the spark plug should fire. And the camshaft is in the neutral position. So in other words, the cam lobes themselves are not affecting the tappets. The tappets are sitting flat on the camshaft. And as you can see, there's definitely a need to set valve lash because this thing moves way too much. You need 2 1/2-inch wrenches. You need a 1/2-inch wrench to hold the base of the tappet, and you need another 1/2-inch wrench to turn the adjustment nut. So basically, you take this, you hold it, and then you take the second wrench, which is right there, and you will either theoretically loosen the bolt, which would close the space or the lash between the tappet and the valve stem, or if you have to increase it, you would tighten it down into the tappet itself. Make sure your wrenches are clean, there's no debris or past projects still stuck on it, and you need to have a fairly good feeler gauge, and you're going to drag this feeler gauge in and out between the two. How about we get it in there? There we go. Between the two until you just feel light, very light drag. According to the manual, just for good measure, tappet adjustments can be made immediately after assembling the valves, springs, and locks. With the tappets in the lowest position and the engine cold, the clearance should be 8 thousandths for the intake, or inlet they call it, and 16 thousandths for the exhaust. So I'm going to go ahead, get that done. I did just spray a little bit of clear on the lifter cover. I gotta let that dry before I can reinstall it, but there's a big quart gasket that goes here. I already got the bolt and the copper washer cleaned. I've already done already did a test fit, made sure everything still worked there. And then what I do here is I just put it in dry. In other words, I don't put any Permatex or anything like that. Just make sure it's super clean. Put it all together, take the bolt, snug it down, and then just give it just a little bit more. Anything more than that, you can cave the cover in. And just for a side note, this setup and this adjustment process is exactly the same for a big block Kohler. So a K 241 through the K 341, I think it is. And then obviously on the Magnum side, it's the M10 through the M16. And no, that's not a machine gun. That's what it's actually called. I have an Magnum 16 and M16 right there. Anyways, all right, so let me get this done and then let's take a look at the final product for the day. For a little tease, I just brought it out here and set it up on the frame. I think it's going to look amazing. I know I've caught some heat about not actually painting the entire tractor or anything to that effect. Personally, I like it. I like tractors that are just kind of like in their work clothes, so to speak. The engine is just looking the part perfectly to match the frame and everything. This is how I'm going to start the engine up also. I'm just going to put some filler bolts in here. That's where the bell housing would bolt up to. Just get some bolts and stick them in the hole so the oil doesn't blow out when I start the engine up, because this is, and I'm going to just put a temporary hand throttle on it just to get it started, get it basically broken in. I'm just going to bolt it to this frame because it's big enough to handle it. And just break it in, let it run for a while with no load whatsoever. Just let the, just let it run. Got the drain plugs in, everything looks good. Oh, can't wait. Next up, carburation and the magneto. Everything else is looking pretty good. Also, God, I like this tractor. These tractors are pretty cool, but all right, guys, thank you very much for watching. This is part 3 on the engine, part 4 coming up shortly. And hopefully, hopefully I'm not going to set any timetables, but hopefully very soon we'll have this engine running and breaking in. All right, thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until the next project, you guys have a great day.